The move from her, this one I found was fictional. If you like non-fiction, check out the other ones and let's jump in. It was a gloomy July evening. The temperature was close to 85 degrees, and my shirt was soaked with perspiration. I had been a county sheriff for nearly 20 years, and that was what the badge that I wore on my chest proclaimed. At 3 in the morning, I'm not normally called out. But when it becomes hot outside, people lose their cool. Every now and again, too, one of our good citizens will have the bright notion to overindulge in alcohol and touch up the wife. The call was answered by 2 of my guys. When they arrived, the idiot decided to shoot them, earning himself an additional 10 years in prison. That's when I received their call. The neighborhood, if a collection of run-down mobile homes could be called that, was illuminated up by red and blue flashers. The majority of the gunman's run-down home was rust-colored, and some of the siding had come off. There was no sign of air conditioning, which could account for his demeanor. We considered adding a lot more airflow to his pitiful little hotbox in an attempt to drive the varmint out. However, the constituency finds it offensive to kill innocent bystanders, and our 9 milliliters would have passed by his residence and a few of the neighbors. Furthermore, not only was the idiot's wife present, but she also hadn't provided us with any solid evidence to remove her from the gene pool. Even so, it would have benefited humanity to have her spouse removed. So we just sat there in the heat, taking in the sound of loud ranting inside and the candidates. I guess the guy felt bad about shooting at us. I bet he was even regretting opening his 3rd bottle of Jack. We're going to be here forever if I don't do something, I sighed. I asked my 2 men, do you guys care whether he shot at you? And they both nodded. Then, I inhaled deeply and got to my feet. Over my head, a shot whistling by. I screamed, if you come out right now, Melvin, we are not going to charge you with shooting at us. If you take another shot, you are going to do hard time for a decade. If you hit me, it's going to be life. So, which is it? You have 10 seconds to decide. A pause occurred. Then the trailer door opened and Melvin stepped out, unshaven, wearing a beat-up wife beater and with weary eyes. He raised his hands in the air. Wise move, buddy, I remarked before grabbing him and handcuffing him. Oh my God, he was foul-smelling. The 2 patrol cops took him from me and tossed him, not too gently, into the back of their cruiser. They were on duty when I tiredly stated, you 2 get the wife's statement and then lodge him. No, I wasn't. I got back in my cruiser and drove Wisconsin 121 home. I wanted a few more hours of rack time before the sun rose because the night had been a pain. Wisconsin's geographic location places it between the Great Western Prairie, the icy Canadian North, and the Great Lakes dynamic mixing bowl. Thus, extremely erratic weather is possible there. As Native Americans, we understood the meaning of a lengthy stretch of sweltering summer days that had suffocated the entire state. When the weather turned bad, there would be hell to pay. The devil concluded that the bill was past due because of my unfortunate circumstances. I could sense the approaching storm with my eyes, nose, touch, and ears. The breeze picked up, hot and humid. The air was charged with energy and moving quickly. Great, Armageddon, was what I thought to myself. Thus, I had to pass through the densely forested Plain State Natural Area on my way. The storm, which had been little more than distant flashes of lightning, arrived with a vengeance just as I was getting on the bridge across Chequamegon waters. Nothing compares to being stuck on a bridge above pitch-black water during a thunderstorm. It's horrifying. The wind gusts are the first thing to occur. Luckily, my cruiser was made to police specifications, so it was capable of handling that kind of damage. Still, the wind caused it to tremble on its suspension. And then came the first drips of fat. Their impact made me think I was being chased by a horde of Wisconsin June bugs. I put the wipers on, slowed to 20 miles per hour, and re-entered the woodland. They offered no assistance. I felt as though I were going through a car wash. I was beginning to worry. I had my wipers fully on. However, I was unable to see 10 feet ahead of me. Then the lightning struck. There were forks in the forest all around me, and the pattern was unending. The sound of thunder was devastating. There was no more driving for me. Over my 30 years as a police officer, I have encountered many terrifying circumstances. The worst thing I've ever done, though, was sit there by myself in that forest. It was pitch black outside due to the rain, and the area was constantly lit up with a nightmare atmosphere by the loud thunderclaps and lightning strikes. I started to experience an atavistic sense of dread. It undoubtedly brought back memories of our cave-dwelling days. Back then, we were the prey, not the hunters, and many scary things were hidden by towering trees and impenetrable darkness. It did not take long for me to realize how very prescient that was. Once upon a time, I knew a woman loved me and I loved her back. While I was investigating her murder, I had met her. Her killing. That needs to be explained a little, though. I was a well-educated, bushy-tailed sheriff's investigator married to a stunningly gorgeous, clever woman. Before she entered politics, Janet was the epitome of the ideal wife. It is said that authority corrupts. Yes, my spouse served as a case study. She hopped onto the slick surface and did not come off. In on the bust, I was. Witness protection was granted to her. My marriage ended in divorce. I swore afterward that I would never again interact with the cunning animals. Next, I happened upon Mavis. To be honest, I almost ran her over. It was definitely not the typical boy meets girl scenario. It was late at night and I was traveling through the Nicolet Forest. The scene was uncannily identical to how I currently felt. But it wasn't the end of the world, it was just a heavy downpour. Mavis believed it to be 1946. I took her to have her head examined, of course. Her belfry was completely bat-free, according to the local doctor, and she did appear to possess information that would make the local historical society envious. She also played the part and dressed the part. Her story made no sense at all, of course, until I started looking into it, that is. A few weeks later, I learned a lot of fascinating things. In fact, in 1946, a woman by the name of Mavis Pritchett had vanished. Later on, I found out that Felix Wynne had murdered her. How was that known to me? Wynne, however, admitted to the crime. At the age of 95, he did it while he was dying. Meeting someone you believed you had killed 70 years ago has the power to break someone's heart. The issue was that Mavis was a very attractive 25-year-old with blue eyes and raven hair, while Wynne was in his 90s. That only made her more enigmatic. Now that the crime had been solved, my only dilemma was what to do with Mavis. Allow me to explain her. She is bold, humorous, intelligent, vivacious, and incredibly loving. Yes, the child, that is. As you can see, we sort of had her early on in our romance. In any case, we intended to get married. Thus, the arrival of Tiny Ava was just one more fortunate event in a string of amazing events that befell me. After that, I lived for 9 years with someone who was so unbelievably gorgeous and successful in every way that defines women as a superior species, that I felt as though my heart would burst with joy. Rather, it cracked. An unfortunate reality that had always existed was that someone with Mavis's name had been murdered in 1946. There's no way that's my Mavis. She was completely enmeshed in the present moment and enveloped in delicious flesh. As a result, I labeled every other choice as alternative explanation required. That is, until the long-buried body was discovered. My house was vacant when I got home in a hurry. We used all of the available investigative tools. However, it seemed as though Mavis had vanished off the face of the planet. At last, I came to terms with her permanent disappearance. Thus, I conducted a memorial service for the body of a murder victim who was recently discovered. Most people believed that I was crazy. That is, excluding the 4 genuine pals. The burial is still there, directly next to the home on the hill. A sad spouse and a marble angel supervise it. However, I was terrified of dying because life is a march or die situation. I marched as a result. I was saved by my 9-year-old daughter. My commitment to Ava's upbringing and my affection for her were what kept me on track. I'm proud of Ava. She is exactly 21 years old and resembles her mother. Mavis was a gorgeous young woman with a faultless face and a figure that had been perfected by years of dancing. Her beauty pushed an unstable man to murder. Still, all I am is a county sheriff. I try my hardest. However, nobody ever sees me smile. That is, assuming they aren't with me when I'm talking to my wife on that desolate hill. If they heard me, they would assume I'd gone insane. But I really think I'm close to her at that point. I was waiting for nature to clear its system of the end of the world while parked in the middle of the road. My flashers were a walking billboard for me. After many strong earth strikes, ball lightning burst into the sky above the trees. I'm not exactly sure what happened in that instant afterward. The rain seemed to pass like someone had drawn a curtain, as I recall. And I had a clear, sunny sky above my head as I gazed down a rutted dirt road. That was rather unsettling because the last time I had seen the road it was blacktop and the sky was anything but peaceful. I shifted into gear, fired up the cruiser, and barreled down the street. Reaching the forest's conclusion took me close to an hour. That in and of itself was puzzling, since I calculated that it would only take me a mile to enter open territory. The road was gravel all the way to Wisconsin 73, where it changed to a tiny concrete stretch rather than a wide 2-lane state route. I was where? I turned the laptop around to launch the navigation app. However, there was no internet connection to the browser. The monstrous storm that had just swept over me was also nowhere to be seen. That was perplexing. So I took a southerly turn and began traveling down 73 on a clear Wisconsin morning. Rather than having spent much of the night evicting a drunken loser from a shabby little house, I felt as though I had slept all night. The time on my watch was 8:45. I had forgotten about the lost time. However, I must have slept off throughout the storm. I have no other explanation for the gap than that. I could see farmers using vintage Ford tractors in the corn-filled fields. The large combines and other farm equipment that I was accustomed to seeing were not present. As I drove by, several of the individuals stopped to stare at the cruiser. It appeared as though they had never laid eyes on a Crown Vic. Once I reached Cadott, I pulled off State 27 and proceeded back home. I had stares from folks everywhere I went. Driving a flying saucer was the closest thing to it. After arriving to the hot spot, I parked and walked inside to have my morning coffee. Everyone except the waitress ran to the window as soon as I sat down. I surveyed the diner. The place must have been refurbished, because tables and stools were arranged along a counter rather than in booths. They appeared to be aiming for diner kitsch. The waiter approached. Since my last visit, she had changed. Seeing my suit, badge, and tool belt, along with my Glock 19, additional ammo pouch, pepper spray, handcuffs, and asp, she asked, "What can I get you, Sheriff?" I stated. She turned to a child who was lingering behind the counter and said, "Get the sheriff some coffee. Coffee and eggs." I was thinking, that's interesting, the current owner's name is too. The child was obviously bright and quite attractive. She was only beginning to grow a figure, and it looked like a big one, at around 12. She took a cup from a pile and proceeded to pour coffee from a complex vintage coffee maker. It had an appearance similar to that of vintage cartoons. The feeling of the 1940s merely grew stronger. "What's that car you're driving?" "It looks like a P-51, asked the young child. I had never heard of the stodgy old Crown Vic being likened to a fighter aircraft from World War II. I said with pride, "It's a Ford, a Crown Victoria Police Interceptor with the apprehender package. It can do 150 miles an hour if I needed to." The girl's gaze grew wide. She was a real feisty one, asking excitedly, "Can I ride in it?" It also seemed that she had never heard of predators of children. I replied, "I'll take you for a ride if your mother approves. But you should never get in a car with strangers." The waitress turned to face her. She was clearly her mother. "Can I ride in the sheriff's car?" she cried. After placing my eggs in front of me, the waitress turned to face me and angrily remarked, "That'll be 2 bits. She then continued, "Stop bothering the man. We need you here." The English translation took me a moment. I replied, "Do you mean an entire breakfast is a quarter? We charge more because the food is all fresh," she remarked defiantly. The waitress asked, "Wait a minute, what's this?" As she examined the quarter I took out of my pocket, thinking, they must be having some kind of promotion to advertise the new decor. I declared, "It's a quarter." "No, it isn't. This is a quarter," she stated, pointing to one of those vintage quarters, before the state logo was added. I asked her, "Are you a collector of old coins?" as I produced an ancient coin from my pocket. "What are you talking about?" "This one is from this year," the waitress questioned. Washington's head was emblazoned with the year 1946 on the underside of her quarter. I felt a little dizzy. "Wait a minute. What's the date?" I said as I took a seat on the stool once more. "It's July 29th, the waitress responded, giving me the impression that she was playing a practical joke on me. I said, "What year?" As my uneasiness increased, she believed me to be kidding. "The last time I checked it was 1946. "Isn't that right? She exclaimed, laughing wildly. With a cheeky chuckle, remarked, "No, I think it's 1846. The truth of my predicament was beginning to set in. The actual was this. Her previous appearance was a week ago. It was her 82nd birthday. I ate quickly and departed. Perhaps I had been struck by one of the lightning strikes. Perhaps I had passed out in the middle of the forest due to an aneurysm. Could it be that I had truly been taken back to the 1940s? Whatever the situation, it was obvious that I was no longer in Kansas. I ought to have been horrified. However, I'm a sensible man with a hard head. I didn't care why I was in this circumstance or where it was going. All I could think was that maybe I might save Mavis, that she might still be alive. I knew every aspect of the case by heart. It wasn't until the 31st, 2 days later, when the murder happened. Naturally, I was having issues. Mavis Pritchett was an absolute stranger in 1946. Later, I would take care of that. However, I needed to get rid of the cruiser first. Questions were the last thing I wanted, and the cruiser was drawing too much attention. Above all, I was in need of money. I was flush with 21st century dollars. Otherwise, I would have been cleaning dishes in the diner again had I not discovered an abandoned quarter. Selling the Crown Vic would be a double win for me. Fall Creek was home to a garage that had been operating continuously since the 1930s. Yes, the garage was indeed there. It was selling cars and had a nice appearance. The owner ought to love what I have to offer, I said merrily. After parking, I lifted the hood. 4 males got up from their slouching positions to approach and gaze. The man who was obviously the owner then emerged. They all had bewildered looks. I was relying on the outfit and equipment to prove my legitimacy. The proprietor was a tall, thin, raw-boned man whose overalls were stained with grease. It was obvious that none of them liked police officers when he approached me with a less than cordial "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" expression. I stated with the warmest of voices, "I'm looking to sell this fine automobile. The department doesn't need it anymore and I want somebody local to benefit from it. I'll throw in the shotguns and the special radio for the right price." The proprietor appeared doubtful. "What is this thing anyway?" he exclaimed. Despite the blue oval obviously stating Ford, I said, "It's a Lamborghini," without even blinking. It was who came up with the idea, so I added firmly, "It's an experimental car. The government gave it to us. They made it out of spare parts from one of their fighter planes." "How fast does it go, Sheriff?" asked a lounger. They all let out gasps of surprise when I told them, "It'll do 150 at the top end. But you can drive it at 120 all day." It was an unprecedented pace, considering the majority of their passenger aircraft operated at less than 200 miles per hour. The owner's clear, intense desire for it was evident. His teeth were hurting. "What do you want for it?" he said. The original cost had been $56,000. I was aware that I needed to reduce that to 1940s levels of cost. I could tell I might as well have asked for $50 million when I said $5,000. With a graceful shrug, the owner turned to leave. I pointed at a pristine blue 1940 Ford convertible and hurriedly added, "Okay, since you're local, I'll let you have this fine automobile for $2,000 cash if you'll throw in that little beauty over there." Back then, $2,000 was a year's wage. However, the man's eyes brightened as if he believed he was pilfering the cruiser. We rode to the bank of Fall Creek. The owner played with the shotguns that were racked on the front seat the entire time. "If you blow a hole in the roof, you've bought it anyway," I responded angrily. "What's that?" he asked, gesturing to the laptop that stood between us. That wasn't really an exaggeration in the world of electronic surveillance in the 21st century when I stated, "It's an experimental radio that the government uses to monitor spies." The proprietor took out $2,100 and gave them to me. We took a ride back. He gave me the Ford's title and keys. I signed the cruiser's title and gave him the keys. I was hoping the year of manufacturing escaped his attention. After shaking hands, I departed in my car. The first phase was finished. I had somewhere to stay. I returned to the hot spot as a result. Dot was honing a soda glass while she stood at the counter. "What happened to your car?" she said. "Going all 1940s slang here," I said. "I traded it in for something a lot cooler." Dot nodded encouragingly as she glanced at the little roadster that was sitting outside with its top down. I responded, "Are there any boarding houses around here?" After saying, "Sure, Sheriff. My mom runs one. Do you want me to show you?" She hurried around the counter, took my hand, and pulled me out the door. We moved on to the following block. "Never release my hand, Dot." Did I sense a crush? We pulled up in front of one of those large, sturdy, two-story colonials made of stone. They are everywhere in Wisconsin's wealthy areas. Dot dragged me in without any fanfare. Her mother was standing there wearing a home dress and a bandana pulled over her hair, having given up her waitress uniform. Clearly, she had been doing some cleaning. Above all, she bore a striking resemblance to the Doc's spouse, Eve Pedersen. Dot would soon resemble her mother, Barbara, and Eve would resemble Dot. Thus, it seems that Swedish beauty was inherited. Breezily speaking, Dot added, "The sheriff needs a place to stay while he's in town." The mother of Dot stated, "You can have a room and full board for $5 a week." I know that sounds like a lot, but I'm a good cook. I removed $100 from my stash. She gave me the look as though I had given her a bag of gold doubloons. I said, "That's 5 months in advance, in case I need it." Then, I got to break one of these hundreds, I said to myself. I needed to do one last task before heading out to locate Mavis. That was, to pick up some 1940s clothing and a toothbrush. On Main Street, a haberdashery was located. It was only 2 blocks from my new apartment and right next to the hardware store. I therefore strolled there. I visited a good number of clothes stores, but I haven't been in one quite like that before. Garbage cans held the clothing. The owner followed you around making recommendations, and there were none of the understated marketing techniques. It also seemed more like a feed shop than a place selling elegant men's accessories, with its board floor, musty scent, and overall aspect. The owner was an elderly gentleman who, even for rural Wisconsin, was quite well dressed and refined. He was speaking to an early 30s man who had a lot of dark hair and one of those pencil-thin Clark Gable mustaches over his lip in a friendly manner. I was significantly larger than both of these males, but that was something I had observed in nearly every man I had met thus far. After glancing over my attire, one of them held out his hand and said, "Hi, this is my friend Stanley Wilkes. Where are you from?" "I'm William Morton, the town doctor." "Welcome to our town, Sheriff. My jurisdiction is a long way from here. I'm just in town to clear up the details of a murder case," I answered, shaking his hand. "Really?" "Yes, that was accurate. No homicide was going to occur under my watch, and the jurisdiction was set to expire in 70 years. I knew it was a joke. The Mavis I would meet 70 years later would be in her 90s if I had stopped the murder. However, I was convinced that I was here for a purpose, and the only one I could think of was to stop what was about to happen in 2 days. I cherished Mavis with all of my heart. Hence, I didn't want anything bad to happen to her, even if it meant suffering penalties myself. "Yes, exactly." I grinned ruefully and continued, "My luggage got misplaced on the way here. Around 7 decades. I laughed and said, "I can't wear this uniform all the time. So, I need some clothes to tide me over, just a couple of shirts and pants and other necessaries." While his friend assisted me, the doctor kept me updated. Back then, people didn't visit the doctor for anything little. Doc clearly had a lot of free time on his hands. He said, "We have a nice little town. People are really friendly. We haven't had a sheriff since Orville Hickenlooper died, and we could sure use one. When you get your murder case resolved, you ought to think about settling down here. I know they could use you. If this isn't a dream, I might accept his offer," was my thought at the time. 3 short-sleeved plaid shirts, 2 pairs of khaki pants, and a week's worth of boxers came to a total of about $24. I gave the man one of my hundreds as payment. He appeared unperturbed. "Why don't I take you to our bank and we can break that for you?" the doc asked politely. He then walked me to the bank across the street. The primary observation I made regarding the bank was it's devoid of electronics. All that was present were ledgers and cash drawers, with no workstations, ATMs, or screens in the teller cages. The small-town coziness was the other element. There was a great deal of joshing and everyone knew each other. It resembled a family-run eatery, not the antiseptic environment I know from banks. I got a bunch of change for the second 100 and broke the first one. The doc chit-chatted on what a nice town this was, the whole way down and back. Actually, there wasn't much of a difference between it and the following century. More open lots and lanes were present, along with a few missing structures. However, the overall layout of the location was quite recognizable. In fact, the haberdashery worker wrapped my goods in paper and fastened them with a string. I thanked them and started to carry them out the door when I unexpectedly crossed paths with my fate. Mavis was racing along the road. She appeared slightly disturbed and had her eyes downcast. I didn't notice her approaching because the haberdashery's door opened straight onto the pavement. I got out, and we hit each other. I have 6'2". She is 52. You can guess the outcome of that encounter. To prevent her from tumbling into the street, I took hold of her both arms. I turned her back to face me after that. I could feel the energy crackling across 7 decades as she gazed directly into my eyes. She also could. She appeared both scared and astonished. It was to my advantage. Mavis just saw a large, menacing police officer wearing a Smokey the Bear helmet and carrying tools of the trade about his waist. However, I had spent nearly 10 years living with her as my devoted spouse and child's mother. I was still unable to quickly pull out the wedding album. It was much too soon. With formality, I said, "Pardon me, miss." She simply stood there, gaping at me from her amazing china blue eyes while a flurry of emotions registered. I was starting to feel emotional too. She had escaped fate, and I had loved her. However, I'm sensible enough to save my cards. My main goal was to reclaim her. I tried not to let my feelings show as I said, "I know you from somewhere, don't I?" The impulse seized me to hurl her over my shoulder and run to the closest justice of the peace, but I refrained. With a shake of her own, as to a puppy trying to dry itself, she nervously answered, "Sheriff, I don't believe so." She clearly believed that she knew me as well. However, she also believed it was wise to play it close to her delicious chest. Mavis was about to say anything when a greasy little pretty boy, wearing a real Elvis hairstyle and Cupid bow lips, grabbed her by the elbow and exclaimed, "What are you doing talking to this guy, Mavis? You're my girl." His tone of possessiveness and disdain nearly made me grab my asp. Well, they would certainly find our 21st century argot was ridiculous also if she had said, "Don't flip your wig." I was just jowing with the sheriff, Jimmy. Pulling her up the steps toward her apartment, he added, "Well, you'd better get around to Provident or I might find myself another girl." She turned to face me, wishing to turn back. That's when the doc emerged. He saw them walk into the apartment together. "That's Jimmy Rollins," he said. "He is a bad punk. However, his parents are well off. What a lovely girl she is. I have no idea why she spends so much time with him. I suppose one can never fully account for taste." I knew why Mavis was with Jimmy Boy. I knew that little prick of a man was arrogant, and I also knew that she would be drawn to any man who exudes strength. Naturally, I had plans to change that arrangement. Air conditioning was a luxury in the 1940s, so naturally, they would have the windows open when I heard Mavis wailing from her apartment's wide-open windows as I was just climbing into the car. I said to myself, "Excellent. Exactly what I required to hear." Though I wouldn't actually be born for another 27 years, I had nothing to say about it at the time. The sound of my true love having sex with another guy nearly killed me. I had slept in the warm comfort of her mother's house like the dearly departed, and Dot rolled me out at 7 in the morning. "It's Tuesday and I'm off today," Dot stated. "You can thus give me a ride in your tiny automobile." I admired her boldness. "What does your mother think about that?" I asked. Dot chuckled, saying, "She thinks you're awesome." "Perhaps you might be my other father," I exclaimed, laughing out. "You've got one already." Her father was an elderly Swedish guy with a shaky command of English, but he was obviously devoted to his daughter, and I believe that was the source of Dot's boundless energy. One of the benefits of being a lodger was that breakfast was always at the hot spot. Dot and I were just finished when Jimmy and Mavis entered and took a seat at a nearby table. Dot came over to join them, telling Mavis all about our planned day with excitement. Jimmy gave off the appearance that he was channeling the role played by James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, but in reality, it was more like Rebel Without a Clue. Wearing a white t-shirt, a pair of heavy blue jeans, motorcycle boots, and a pack of Luckies rolled up in one sleeve, he looked like a 1940s punk. His thick black hair was styled into an oily waterfall over his forehead, and the grease was slowly dripping down his nose. Mavis was talking animatedly to Dot, while she was looking wistfully at me. She still seemed bewildered, but I didn't blame her. I wasn't any better off than her. I already knew that Mavis loved kids. She was a terrific mom in another dimension. While Dot was chatting away about her day, he decided it was time to act like a jerk. He angrily screamed, "Stop talking to that brat," seized Mavis, and whipped her around in her chair. "It's meant to be you and me. I won't put up with my girlfriend treating me badly. Don't you dare talk to me like that," she yelled angrily as she shook free his clutches and got to her feet. "Maybe I'll go with Dot and the sheriff if you can't behave properly." She then approached me, grabbed my arm, and asked if I may ride with you too while Jimmy picked up some groceries. Jimmy got up and strode toward me, a man of maybe 5'6" or 140 years old, with a banty rooster-like build. He was talking to my chest when he shouted, "She's my girl, so screw off, or I'll mess you up." I had to giggle, which was bad because it gave him the impression that he was going to swing. I caught his fist in midair, feeling like a small girl's, and then I slowly twisted him to his knees and the floor. While he was yanking his fist from my hand and calling me derogatory terms that I didn't want Dot to hear, my little buddy was plainly having the time of his life. Mavis had a terrified and seductive look on her face. Mavis is a respected teacher in this community and a grown woman, I remarked. She is free to do as she pleases, and she is even welcome to ride up to Eau Claire with Dot and me. I am going to let go of your hand now, and I would strongly advise you to not push this any further, I said in a scary tone of voice. It goes without saying that if you ever consider venting your frustrations to Mavis, we'll speak again. He yelled and sat there on the floor, gripping his wrist as I violently twisted his hand, enough to inflict him some pain. Jimmy watched us from the diner steps as the three of us walked out of the hot spot and climbed into my shiny blue Ford, Mavis in the front, myself in the back leaning over the seat, Dot in the back. Jimmy cried out, "Grab her." I nearly got out of the car again. Jimmy, though, hurried inside the diner. I'm a veteran police officer. I was aware that he had not given us his last word. It was a gorgeous, sunny day in Wisconsin on Tuesday, July 30th. The top was so down. Our former love was starting to work its mysterious magic now that it was just Mavis and me. Long-term married couples that are able to maintain that special something have a strong bond that exists on a subconscious level. That was the kind of close bond Mavis and I shared for the entirety of our marriage. Our present was now being influenced by the future. Mavis had looked away from me. Rather, she was integrating herself into me in a womanly manner. We were merely making slight physical contact. However, our thoughts were in sync, and our hearts were racing in unison. I don't want to go to Eau Claire. It's too far away and you two are creeping me out, Dot remarked from the back seat. I smiled at Mavis and enthusiastically remarked, "Then how about a picnic?" She was gazing at me with a confused, lustful, and odd expression. I understand. The emotions had to originate someplace because they were so strong. However, she was unable to determine where. It was to my advantage. I understood that our history was her future. At the market we bought some tasty munchies. It was not a supermarket, but rather a little shop. It was all remarkably fresh. I then took us to a location with a view of the mill pond a short distance outside of town. To get there, we had to cross a small creek. Mavis and I helped each other over the stones, while Dot jumped across like a small cat. We covered the edge of the bluff with a blanket. It was the location of our future home for the next 7 decades. But for now, it was just a peaceful area of the forest. It was evident to me that Mavis was sensing something. It was just how I had planned. For nearly 10 years, she had made her house a lovely place to live because she loved it. She stared at me, perplexed. I ought to have taught her. What can you say, though? Hi, I'm your husband from 70 years in the future and we are sitting on the spot where our house will be. I know that sounds a little bizarre, but it's true, trust me. I just held on to my cards, waiting for the cosmos to decide what to do with us, because she would have rushed screaming to the authorities with a personal protection order. The one thing I was certain of was that Mavis would not be harmed. It was obvious she was thrilled to be with us. I observed her chatting along with Dot about ducks. They both had their eyes fixed on the mill pond. I could therefore get away with staring at her. Being both so close and so far away hurt. Oh my God, she had been missed. Subsequently, she and Dot began walking up a little hill while continuing to laugh and converse. It was the spot where the distinctive drooping branches of a little willow tree had just begun to appear. The two girls were hoping to get a better look at Mill Pond. I have hundreds of instances of this identical situation, all but our daughter, the young child strolling alongside Mavis. I remembered with a smile of fondness. Then it dawned on me. The moment was coming for her to stand where I had buried her. When they got there, I jumped up and was ready to yell, "Mavis!" She had Dot's hand in hers. They pivoted to observe the teeming wildfowl at the creek. Without saying anything, Mavis suddenly crumpled like a balloon about to lose air. I ran over to her. I grabbed her up and carried her back down the hill as Dot was on her knees holding her hand and yelling, "Mavis, Mavis," in an agonized tone of voice. I hadn't held her since the day I lost her until that moment. It hurt so much. As soon as I took Mavis out of the spot's effects, she began to recover. She held me tight in fear. Although I knew what had happened, I was at a loss for words. Telling someone they were standing on their own grave is a difficult task. Although it was absurd, I told her, "You'll be fine now, Mavis. It must have been something you ate." I mean, what else could I say? With her enormous eyes, she said, I felt like I stepped into a void. I was falling into oblivion. I'm a police officer, you know, so I've seen these things before. It was probably just low blood sugar, I comfortingly said. Really, I had a politician's voice. She must have been satisfied with what I said. I set her down. She walked with an unsteady gait. She gripped my arm again and chuckled playfully. The "sorry for frightening you too" was her apology. I appreciate the show, Dot stated while laughing. No one has ever fainted in front of me before. Dot was a lively little minx, and I had faith that she would retain all of her vivacity well into her 70 seconds. My response was, "Maybe I'd better get you home." Appreciatively, Mavis gave a nod. After gathering our belongings, we went back to the car. Everything had come crashing down between Mavis and me after the amount of time we had spent together. We returned to Main Street in an easy spirit of fellowship. I went to Mavis's apartment after dropping Dot off at the hot spot. As we pulled up to her apartment, I noticed Jimmy's face vanishing from view. After getting out, Mavis came over to stand by my side. I could tell that she was going through the same kind of trouble saying goodbye to me that I was going through. However, as previously mentioned, how can one initiate the discussion that will inevitably be necessary between us? All I could muster was, "I hope I see you again." "Oh yes, Sheriff," she anxiously exclaimed. "It sounds like something I'd enjoy." "If Jimmy causes you any trouble, I am just 2 blocks away," I replied with a hint of concern. "In the boarding house of Barbara Hanson." "Sheriff, there's no need to be concerned about Jimmy," she added with a charming smile. "With him, I'm more than capable. His love for me is too great for him to be violent." Turning around, she climbed the steps gently. I could almost feel the passionate nights we'd spent together as I recalled the swaying of those round, muscular buns. She was too beautiful for Jimmy, I could tell. Plus, I had a feeling we'd cross paths again. Like any other police operation, I was handling this. It was, to a certain extent. It was my intention to stop a murder. As a result, I needed an exhaustive map of the area. I consequently spent the remainder of that day and the following one conducting reconnoitering. I knew that if I intervened to prevent Mavis's murder, it would alter many events in the timeline. Perhaps my actions were self-centered. The consequences would follow inexorably. On my chronology, though, everything that transpired in the 21st century had already happened. Consequently, it could never unhappen. I took that as a sign that the love we felt for each other, the driving force that had led me here, was also shaping Mavis's feelings toward me. I have no doubt that her immediate attraction would not have been as strong if it hadn't been. She did, in fact, have a live-in boyfriend. I had only just met her. The boyfriend posed an issue. To be honest, I didn't think Mavis loved him, I just thought she needed a boyfriend. She possessed that quality in abundance. She was unhappy since she couldn't commit to a single man. Whoever the fortunate man was, she was utterly devoted to him. Jimmy, in my not-so-humble view, was a skell. Thousands of people like him had passed me by throughout my time in law enforcement. His only redeeming quality was the small amount of money he possessed. He was a feeble, narcissistic, and self-absorbed individual. However, I was well aware that Felix Wynn was the true culprit. Wynn lay lifeless in the nursing home the last time I saw him. Even though he looked like a mummy before, I knew he wouldn't look that way now. I intended to observe him closely. My goodness, to be honest, I started to see the 21st century as back then. I had a hard time keeping track of the dates. I was interested in gauging Wynn's stature when I was younger. It would be another half-century before they had access to the internet, and I had to track him down first. Thus, I was confined to using antiquated technology. It worked amazingly well. I strolled down Main Street to the phone booth located at the intersection of Lafayette and Lincoln. Inside was a pay phone. One of those has not existed since I was a child. I wasn't there to answer the phone. The phone book was what I sought. It was quite thin. Of course, in 1946 the entire county had just a few thousand residents, the most of whom lacked a phone. I tore it open and felt down the page to find a Wynn. Felix R. He resided near the railroad on the western edge of the town. That was presumably due to the fact that the high school was only a short stroll away. It was evident to me from the 21st century case files that Wynn had lost his mind while teaching there, along with Mavis. Mavis has breathtaking beauty. She has an allure that would drive any man insane. But most men follow the guidelines. Wynn didn't. Wynn had been engaging in what we would refer to as sexual harassment, groping and fondling. However, the guys in 1946 would have called that flirting. In any case, Mavis took issue with it and lodged a complaint with the district. They paid her no attention, up until the day Wynn lost it and tried blatantly to screw Mavis on her teacher's desk. When a group of people heard Mavis's cries for assistance, 2 male teachers took Wynn off of her. The district hushed it up by firing both of them because the entire incident was so unprecedented and humiliating. Was that reasonable? Back then, they believed that. As a result, a man who was obviously mentally ill was wandering around, looking for his next opportunity to take aim at his passion. That would result in Mavis's death if I did nothing. I drove by Wynn's cabin. Made of worn-out timbers, it appeared to have 2 rooms with a shithouse in rear. It remained extremely hot. Wearing a wife-beater and slacks held up by suspenders, he sat on his porch. After parking, I approached him. He got up with suspicion. He was larger than Jimmy, but even in those days, the majority were. He appeared to weigh around 5/8 of a pound and 80 pounds. With his thick black hair slicked back from his forehead by a lot of what was termed hair tonic back then, it was evident that he thought of himself as a ladies' man. For the most part, it was oil. Wynn shared the Doc's pencil-thin mustache. Among leading males in movies, Clark Gable remained a legend. His nose was a touch too big, and his thin, irate lips were adjacent to tiny, beady eyes. I put on my prettiest tourist mask and said, "Mister, I'm lost. Do you know the location of Fall Creek?" Win gave me a long, hard stare. He was a conceited person. But I avoided looking like I was scared because I was a defenseless tourist. "Get off my property, or I'll shoot you," yelled Win. Win got up and strode into his trash can. I anticipated that he would emerge brandishing a shotgun. I was tempted, God help me. I could shoot him then and there, get rid of the whole thing. I had no shortage of sites to bury a corpse. However, I wanted to simulate this as closely as possible to what actually occurred. I simply had to find out. I quickly turned around and headed back to my car. Laughing, Win fired a gun into the air. I cranked the Ford and hurried back out onto the road, returning to the town. I had seen and comprehended my opponent. All that remained was to wait for the cards to be dealt. I was seeing the sunset from my car, which was parked directly in front of Mavis's apartment. I stooped to fit into the seat. I've been a police officer for a very long period, and I am highly skilled in stakeout surveillance. I was invisible to everyone. Mavis was gone from my life since the picnic. I had noticed the dress, though. She was wearing the same clothes when I encountered her later as she down the stairs. Clearly, she was dressed to impress. It had a short wool skirt that accentuated her amazing legs, vintage nylon pants with a back seam, 3-inch heels, and a lovely white shirt. A jaunty, short wool jacket that complemented her skirt completed the whole look. I could tell by the weather that she was wearing her one and only nice clothing. The sun had already fallen and the temperature must have been in the 80s. Something like that in this heat would only be worn by an impressing girl. She waited for the bus to cat out in front of the doc's clinic, under the streetlight. It extended all the way to Cornell along State 27. The bus arrived. As soon as she boarded, it took off, made a right turn on 27 and slowly made her way to whatever would happen to Kata and Mavis. I put the Ford in drive and trailed along. Mavis was dropped off in front of the Crescent. In the following century, the location remains the same. It appears to be a bar that was formerly an old barn. The only real distinction was the sign outside. Rather than a contemporary neon, it was lit by a single green-shaded light bulb. Mavis went up the steps to the front door and opened it. After parking, I waited for half an hour. A huge celebration was in progress. There were people moving around, and many of them were inebriated. I recalled that one of the locals was welcomed home. He had recently returned from the Second World War. Amid the merriment, Mavis was the only one who stood out. She appeared unhappy as she slouched to the table. Jimmy was chatting back and forth with all of his buddies while smoking a Lucky and sat next to her with his arm straddling the back of her chair in a possessive manner. A drink was in front of each of them. What had been dropped into Mavis's drink was known to me. I had perused the autopsy findings. The case file included information on the existence of chloral hydrate. Looking around, I saw a few things. Win was smoking and looking as jittery as the saying goes while he sat at the bar. The other was the face of Mavis. Her eyes were both black. I'd heard that when someone goes completely insane, they literally turn red. Up until then, I had never encountered that occurrence. Since my goal was to stop Mavis's murder, my police officer's mind was screaming at me to cool off. But I was reaching for the asp because I loved my wife. The 8-inch asp is made of an extremely rare metal alloy. You might carry it in your pocket. With a simple flick of the wrist, it develops into a fighting baton that is 2 feet long. Because of the way the metal is made, the baton's tip is flexible. You can therefore whip it at nearly supersonic speeds. As a result, an asp strike has the same effect as getting shot. My feelings were extremely stirred up. I needed to go before I made a foolish decision. I got up and hurriedly left the door. When I finally arrived at the parking lot, I knelt down and placed my hands on my knees. I was inhaling deeply and attempting to regain control of myself. My boiling rage subsided after a while, and I turned to head back inside. I then heard a mocking voice ask, "Are you too chicken to fight me? What's the matter?" After Mavis mistreated me, I beat her up and made her sell herself to Felix. "It's your time now." I gazed up into Jimmy Rawlins's arrogant, smirky visage. There he stood, all out-of-place arrogance. Behind him, in a semicircle, were roughly 8 of his friends as well. The pals were part of the false sense of confidence he had. "Pen is from heaven," was my thought. After hitting and drugging my wife, this idiot, I was going to give him the bill. I was furious at the idea of this jerk putting his fists on Mavis's tender skin. Trying not to show my excitement, I answered, "All right, boy, bring it on." The idiot truly leaped into a position akin to that of the Marquess of Queensberry, with his fists up and his left foot placed ahead of his right. I had no time to waltz all over the place like Gentleman Jim. With contempt, I exclaimed, "Seriously," and gave him a crotch kick. Jimmy was so considerate to stretch his legs that way. The kick was significantly more effective as a result. I unleashed all my suppressed anger on it, and it raised Jimmy 6 inches off the ground. He doubled over and let out a loud, choked grunt. That was handy since it meant I could smack his face down on it without having to lift my knee quite as high. I heard the snapping of facial bones. Jimmy boy would no longer be as attractive or as manly as he once was. He landed hard. I stooped to seize his right hand, jerking it out from his body. I then pressed my heel against it. He gave a painful cry. I could hear the sound of music as the bones crunched loudly. That can come across as a bit too brutal. However, that was the hand that struck my spouse. He was not going to use it on any other woman. It only took a few seconds, maybe 5. With a flip of my wrist, I unleashed the asp, turned to face his pals, and exclaimed, "Which one of you knuckleheads is next?" The largest of them lunged towards me, exclaiming, "That ain't fair. I know a lot about the asp. If you work in law enforcement, you absolutely must be." I also had a strong desire to return to Mavis, so I gave him a single strike to the kneecap. I'm not sure how sophisticated orthopedic surgery was in 1940. However, I was certain that they could repair part of the ligaments. I cried, "Anybody else?" and turned to wave the asp. It had only taken me 20 minutes or so to become sidetracked. However, I was shocked to learn that Mavis had departed from her spot when I returned. Worse still, Wynne wasn't present. Though I have faced difficult circumstances, none have been as bad as the day I lost Mavis. But I almost died on that empty chair. Not again, I said to myself as I ran to my car. Wynne's place made the most sense. The visit yesterday had told me where he resided. It didn't matter how far ahead of me he had gotten. I didn't know. I was intending to show there just after the start of whatever celebrations he had in store. Even though Wisconsin 27 was paved, it was a fairly little street. One of the vintage Ford 239 flathead engines, so cherished by 1950s hot rodders, powered my devoted 1940 Roadster. Although I had no idea what Wynne was driving, I was very certain that I was faster. Between the Crescent and Wynne's house, I think I covered around 18 miles at 70 miles per hour. In a 1940s automobile, on 1940s roads, I would have been in the trees if I had moved any faster. The automobile began to shake and sway as I approached the town boundaries. Naturally, I slowed down. The right front tire exploded at that moment, so it was a smart move. Damn. I muttered to myself as I forced the automobile to the side of the road. A few would have sat there in exasperation, banging on the steering wheel. However, I was running on adrenaline and in a panic. I was still maybe 5 miles away from the intersection of Main Street and 27. It would be another mile to get back to Wynne's apartment. But the meticulous reconnaissance of yesterday had paid off. 27 slanted toward town, and I knew that. Had I been operating a vehicle, I would have driven to the intersection and made a right turn to return to the residence on the other side of town. However, I was only a quarter of a mile away in a straight line through the woods and across a recently plowed field. I leaped out of the vehicle and ran as quickly as I could into the trees. After crossing Bridge Creek, I discovered a trail in the surrounding bushes that took me to the high school's wide fields. It was a cloudless July night, and while it was getting close to 11 p.m., the moon was full. While I continued to beat, I considered the timing. I hadn't seen Mavis for almost an hour at this point. The medicine would take some time to work on her, but once it did, Wynne could quickly get her out of the pub. Since Wynne had all night and didn't know anyone was chasing him, he wouldn't be in a rush to go home. He could be less than 15 minutes ahead of me, I calculated. I was running across the farmer's field at full speed, focusing on Wynne's shack. There was no time for subtlety. The entrance door was the only door present. Perhaps Wynne was standing behind it, shotgun in hand. But he was unaware of my approach. I also knew he would have other things on his plate. My heart raced. Nevertheless, I deliberately decelerated, crept up on the porch, and softly opened the door. I heard whispering. They were in the sleeping quarters. I moved towards that direction, using my asp to the fullest. I caught Wynne gloating, "You're my woman now." A gasp and the sound of a sloppy kiss followed. A slap and a loud yell of pain followed that. I was aware that he had slapped Mavis after she had bitten his lip. During the investigation, she informed me of this. She was also describing Wynne's manhood in a way that was rather unladylike. A gargling sound interrupted her speech. Wynne was strangling Mavis while he leaned back. I was standing at the foot of the bed now. I could target a lot of his personal real estate due of his position, which was delightfully easy. There was the distinctive crack as the asp's tip reached supersonic speed. Furthermore, the first blow struck his nutsack right at its base. It sounded like a watermelon being struck by a 9mm. I understood that Wynne would have nothing left to live for. Wynne let out a cry and leaped into the air. For all the world, he appeared to be a marlin attempting to elude a fisherman's line. When Wynne fell back on Mavis, she exclaimed, "Wow," and started to writhe in an attempt to get her breath. I grabbed his thick, oily hair and hauled the completely lifeless man away from my wife. I wanted to tell him all the imaginative things I planned to do to him. However, I realized I would be squandering my breath. Felix Wynne had passed away more quickly than a doornail. It had to have been too much anguish. Yeah, I could see right away that he was a lousy ticker. Now it was only a matter of getting us out of there. I knew Wynne's death would be attributed to natural causes. In 1946, forensic science would have never guessed that the purple imprint on his balls was caused by an asp strike, and there were no obvious signs of foul play. That meant Jimmy Boy would be in the hospital for a very long time and Wynne was dead. Overall, a successful day's work. Jimmy wasn't likely to cause any legal issues, in my opinion. This was not the politically correct society of the 21st century. This was rural Wisconsin in the 1940s. They would never bring charges against a man for starting a fight, particularly if the victim and 8 of his pals started it. I gave Mavis a look. I moved over to the bed and took a seat. She recoiled in response. I pictured her wanting nothing to do with a man touching her. I then softly said, Mavis, you're safe now. No one is ever going to hurt you again. Since you are my wife, I swear to protect you with my life. She ceased to writhe and began to cry. It was pitiful. In the most humble and kind way I could, I asked, would it be okay if I held you, simply to comfort you? I differ from the other man. With a pitying nod, she sat up. She wrapped her arms around my neck and wept silently on my shoulder. I held her and continued to say, it's okay, my love, in my calmest possible tone. I'm with you right now, and I never will be. At last, her tears ceased. My car is just on the other side of the woods, if you can walk, I said. I'll carry you if not. She rose to her feet and fell back again. Can I help dress you? I said. She gave another nod. That was the last thing she had spoken. I covered her wide, rippling hips and dressed up her long, gorgeous legs. She remained still as she lay there. After helping her to sit up, I gently assisted her into her shirt. I lifted my spouse and took her outside into the darkness. Her head was lying on my shoulder, her right arm encircling my neck. She had the feather-like lightness. I was so blind to how beautiful she was. It was a thrilling walk through the forests and meadows. I might be dead somewhere in the 21st century, I thought to myself as I held her in my arms. But it's irrelevant. In this one, I am still alive, and she is in my arms. For the first time since that catastrophic day in November of a future that seemed like it would happen either 10 years ago or 70 years from now, I was joyful. Oh my God, it was unclear. I'd already picked up on one strange thing. Our relative ages were retained in the realignment of the universe. In 1946, Mavis was 25. In actuality, I was closer to 52. But in this world, I was back to the 32-year-old me, and believe me, I could tell the difference. I was as dead as Mavis had been the day I met her, as far as I knew. Alternatively, it could have been someone in a deep coma dreaming of a joyful ending. It made no difference at all. All I cared about was being with her in a thriving post-war America. It was as though we had both had a total reset. I got her into the seat of the Ford after opening the passenger door. She fell to lie across the front as soon as I closed the door. It was fortunate that Mavis was still under the drug's influence. Maybe she wouldn't recall much of what had transpired. I removed the car's jack and replaced the tire. I was tired and my shirt was drenched from replacing the tire. I was unable to return her to the Hanson residence. I then took a car to Mavis's apartment, which was the only other sensible location. Jimmy wouldn't be returning there, I knew it. It was a clear and sunny August 1st when I woke up. I was dozing off in Mavis's one and only cozy recliner. I was still wearing my khakis and short-sleeved plaid shirt. Glancing around the room, I noticed a serious set of eyes observing me from the bed. She was sitting up and was still dressed from the previous evening. With suspicion, she asked, "Who are you?" With a light-hearted tone, I said, "Your knight in shining armor, at your service, madam." Mavis responded, "No, who are you, really?" With a horrified expression. I needed a firebreak between last night and our future together since this was going to require tact. Mavis was not interred in an unmarked tomb in the Nicolet. Rather, she was alive and well. We therefore had our entire lives ahead of us. However, there was a shift into that new lifetime that needed to be handled carefully. Even if there had been no drugging and rape last night, I knew this conversation would be devastating for both of us. I just couldn't bear to lose her once more. I hadn't had my coffee in the morning. I then remarked softly, "I never use my intellect until after my first cup of coffee. We can have a conversation at the hot spot if we stroll down there." She replied, "I need to take a bath and wash all this off me." She made a motion down her body. I understood her conversation. "I guess I should too," I remarked. "How about we get together there in an hour?" For the first time, she grinned and said, "You get breakfast. Young man, you have a lot of explaining to do." Her unwavering spirit had returned. I was seated at a table in the hot spot an hour later. Showers were uncommon in the 1940s unless you were living in a barracks, so I had taken a bath. After shaving, I put on another of my new shirts. I had a whole new manhood. "Can you bring 2 coffees over here?" I asked Dot, then took a seat as far away from the group as possible. After a few minutes, Mavis entered. She was plainly angry and breathtakingly attractive. She wore a soft cashmere outfit. Betty and Veronica wore knee socks, a pleated skirt, saddle shoes, and a sweater. It displayed her incredible rack and her lovely, slender legs. A little silk scarf was tucked idly about her neck. Mavis took a seat opposite me. Dot placed a coffee cup before her. With typical Dot cheekiness, she asked, "Did Jimmy give you those?" Mavis's beauty remained untarnished despite her 2 shiners. Mavis chuckled, "No, I bumped into a door, what a clumsy me." With genuine eyes, Dot remarked, "I hope you even the score, Sheriff. Are you able to take him into custody?" "I think he's in the hospital now, and nowhere near as pretty as he was yesterday," I added, laughing heartily. "Accidents will occur, you are aware of this." That was Mavis's test as well. She had been living with and clearly screwing the guy before this. I was curious about her reaction to her lover's accident. Mavis exclaimed, "Good," with a great deal of self-satisfaction, looking at her as if she had just understood there was a God. Dot laughed and gave a firm nod. Under her arm were a handful of menus. She gave them to us, pivoted on her heel, and continued to laugh as she left. It was obvious Jimmy didn't have many friends. I took a quick peek at the menu before focusing my attention on a set of china blue eyes. They were systematically piercing my mind. Mavis is an extremely strong-willed and bright woman. She had been raped, drugged, and assaulted the previous night. Many ladies would be destroyed and unable to handle it. Mavis demanded clarification. I felt a wave of relief as I gazed at her picture-perfect face, with each feature precisely positioned and balanced beneath her thick, wavy black hair. It would not bother me if I died. This was my desired location. I responded, "You graduated from the normal school in Eau Claire, and you taught English lit at the high school, so you've probably read H.G. Wells, right?" Mavis appeared stunned. Outraged, she exclaimed, "How could you know that? Have you been snooping around in my private life? You are aware of my rights." Feisty, raped, and defeated. I adored Mavis like that. "It's part of the plot, so relax," I added, laughing. "However, you'll need to be open-minded. You're familiar with Wells' The Time Machine." "I assigned it to my students," she remarked, nodding her head in agreement. I responded with, "Do you believe any of that could happen?" "That's silly," she exclaimed, laughing. "Of course that was not possible. With this, where are you heading?" I felt that the conversation was not going in the direction I had intended. If I revealed the true story to Mavis, she was probably going to leave. "I just wanted to find out how open-minded you are," I added, laughing. The moment I said that, I realized how weak it sounded. With an inquisitor's stoicism, she murmured, "You called me your wife last night." I realized there was no way I was going to get out of that. I responded by saying, "Sorry, figure of speech. What I meant to say was my future wife." With a deceptive smile, I said, "I would have added in mother of my children, but I thought that was getting ahead of myself." She returned the seductive smile and exclaimed, "Oh ho, are you not the brave one? How can you believe that I would even give you a moment of my time?" "You felt the attraction," I remarked, glancing at her intently. Jimmy, too, was witness to it. "I'm not sure what's affected me. However, I cannot imagine my existence without you." That crossed the boundary far too much, and my remarks were overly sincere. I couldn't even talk about how horrible losing Mavis had been without feeling something leak into my voice. It really worried Mavis. I quickly stopped talking. "How could you say something like that?" Mavis angrily exclaimed. "I've never even met you." Jokingly, I remarked, "Perhaps in a previous life, we were married. Perhaps that clarifies the situation." She exhibited the restless behavior common to women when their emotions get too intense. I was relying on our love for each other to carry things to its eventual end, but that was obviously not going to happen. "I don't know who you are or why you are messing with me," she said in an irritated tone. "However, I do believe that there has been a meaningful exchange between us. I can't figure out what's causing it, and it bothers me," she added, growing angrier by the moment. "I know you saved me because I recall most of what happened last night, even the unwilling bonding. However, you should go unless you can clarify what you just said." Now it was just a matter of chopping the nuts. I put on my most convincing voice and said, "Let's head somewhere quiet. What I have to tell you won't register with you. However, I'm relying on your prior faith in me to support my current need for your confidence." We entered her tiny flat. It was a warm location. Her living area featured 2 upholstered chairs, a table with a small lamp next to it, and a floor lamp beside one of the chairs. That chair was the one I had slept on the previous evening. The painted wood floor was covered with a cheap, tidy looped rug. A few bookcases had racks of books. When Mavis noticed where I was gazing, she admitted to herself, "I like to read." She had resided in the library during our marriage, so I knew that. A well-made bed stood against the wall. The restroom was the only additional room. Mavis appeared to be using a hot plate for cooking. I took a seat in one chair. She took the opposite seat. I took note of how well everything was arranged. The small sink had no pots or junk in it. Mavis had always been an excellent housekeeper, and it was obvious that she had a strong sense of neatness in her. She was giving me a serious look. Though unsettling, the 2 bruises did not take away from her flawless skin tone or the inherent form and profound intelligence of her eyes. Her eyebrows were arched, thick and black. She was anticipating my telling of my tale. Alas, in the words of the British, in for a penny, in for a pound. "What I'm about to tell you is true," I said. "I'm not sure how to prove it, but I want you to have faith in your emotions. I'll assist you in realizing my sincerity." "We were married for 9 years, I said, sighing. "We were head over heels in love. Our lovely daughter, Ava, is ours. I have no other evidence that this actually occurred except this." I reached inside my pocket and took out my phone. It was switched off. I had to save the battery for just like this. Mavis looked like she was ready to explode. Then the phone diverted her attention. She had a perplexed expression. "What's that?" she asked. I said, "This is my phone. This is the 21st century method of making phone calls." Mavis ignored that. Then it dawned on her. She said astounded, "Wait, 21st century? Did you say that?" She appeared astonished. I said casually, "Close your mouth, or you'll catch flies." As the phone booted up, I stated, "I can't use it to make phone calls here, because it depends on other technologies to do that." But it will confirm what I'm going to say. Mavis seemed unconvinced. Anybody would respond that way if a total stranger showed up in their living room and delivered an entirely absurd yarn like mine. I stared her in the eyes, willing her to believe what I was going to say. I said, I know that what I'm saying seems weird and I'm probably frightening you, but I suppose you can understand that my phone is not from this period. She nodded hesitantly. At that point, the desktop of the phone popped up. It displayed a recent image of Ava in her Badgers cheerleading gear. She was heart-stoppingly lovely, the spitting image of her mother. Mavis answered dazed, Where did you get that picture of me? I said, It isn't you, it's our daughter Ava. She's 21 and until 3 days ago she was my solitary memento of our time together. I added, I know that your history with men tells you that you would be a fool to believe me. But, let me assure you, our love was true, and this young woman is the fruit of it. Mavis looked like she was suffering from sensory overload. It was understandable. Any sane individual would react that way. I said imploring, I am staking my life and happiness on one throw of the dice, and I will do whatever it takes to help you believe that what I say is true. I continued resignedly, but we are past the event that brought us together. So, I will honor your decision if you choose to live your life without me. I glanced at her trying to show my seriousness. I said, I was a really good lawman in this town, in the future, and they have already offered me the sheriff's position for the duration. If I'm stranded in the 1940s, I'm going to take them up on their offer. Then, I sat back and waited for her to react. Mavis is a very strong-headed and realistic woman. When I first met her, she had gradually come to accept her new reality, and she dealt with it valiantly. Most folks couldn't make the transition. I was banking on her agile mind to accept that we had loved each other in the future, even if my only proof was a picture recorded on a piece of technology she would never understand. So I sat there, with my feelings hanging out. The person I had based my life around was a total stranger. But we had loved each other previously, and it was evident in our interactions that the magic was operating across the decades. Mavis was looking at me with her face clenched into a mask of concentration. I answered as politely and gently as I could, You just appeared out of nowhere one night. You believed it was today, August 1st, 1946. I was the sheriff and I took care of you while we sought to figure out who you were and where you had come from. Mavis looked disbelieving. I hastily continued with, We investigated, and we eventually concluded that you had been murdered by Felix Wynne. Mavis seemed absolutely stunned. She understood I was talking about last night. I added lightly, We closed the case, even though the premise that you'd solved your own murder was crazy. Mavis laughed. She said, That's the most ridiculous story I've ever heard. I hastened to finish. I answered, By that time we were very much in love and we eventually married. We had conceived Ava before the wedding. But the moment was inconsequential. I could see that Mavis was becoming fidgety again, so I brought out my second best card. I answered, We enjoyed a wonderful life at our house. Do you know where that house was located? She shook her head, no, mystified. She had no idea why I had even asked the question. I remarked with increasing certainty, It's where we had the picnic. I know you got the vibe. I could see it. For the first time, Mavis looked at me like she might be beginning to believe me. I responded, After 9 years of marital bliss, they dug out a body. You went, at the exact same instant, leaving me and Ava to deal. Mavis was appearing even more thoughtful. So, I played my whole card. I said, I'm a simple guy and a sensible man. I wasn't positive that anything unusual had transpired. But I buried the body that they dug up, on my land. I continued with gloomy conviction, You were standing on your own grave when you fainted. Mavis looked aghast. It was as her observations in that instant sealed her acceptance of the fact. The feelings swamped her. Some ladies might cry, some would scare out, others might get angry. Mavis is wired differently. I learned that the night she had the first inkling of her murder. She might be smart and practical, but Mavis is a deeply intuitive person. How she feels and how she reacts are the best markers of reality for her. She isn't wanton in any sense. It's just that she trusts her inner instincts. In essence, Mavis listens to what her heart is telling her. Hence, it was nearly inevitable that she would strive to validate what I had just informed her by doing what she did next. Mavis rose from the chair, in all her self-confident female splendor. She was extremely sure of her own sexuality. She took me by the hand and brought me wordlessly to the bed. She forced me to a sitting position. The glance she gave me was scorching. She sat next to me and turned to face me, lips not 6 inches from mine. She said, breathing heavily, Let's try a little experiment to find out if the preposterous tale you just told me is true. Then, she wrapped one arm around my neck, grasped the back of my head with the other, and we kissed for the first time in 10 years. It was like touching a live wire. A thunderbolt of feeling arced across time and destroyed all the awful regret and misery, and every uncertainty. She drew her head back, shocked by the experience. Then her eyes darkened with want and she dragged me backward on the bed. Her mouth opened wide in greeting. She was making frantic tiny groans as her tongue groped for mine. She kept scurrying backward, without releasing go of me, until she was lying back fully, entirely on the bed. We were both clothed. I kissed her avidly. Her movements instantly got frantic. I knew that Mavis was erotically sensitive, but I had never seen a display like that. She finally calmed down enough to open her eyes. Her magnificent chest was heaving like the Atlantic in a nor'easter, and she was still panting like a bloodhound on a hot Georgia porch. Then, she grinned and whispered seductively, "You need me now." I expected there would be something. Then, she elevated her legs, seized me. She yelled in sensation. I looked toward the windows. They were thrown wide open to catch the delicious morning breeze. And Mavis was already getting so raucous that I was frightened that anybody going down the street would believe that I was up here killing her. I was having fun with her. I had not asked to come back to this area. I had never dreamed that this could happen. I had waited for Mavis for almost 11 long years. And now, call it fate, or call it the last thoughts of a dead man. But, as strange as it may seem, I was making love to my dearly deceased wife. Mavis wasn't having any of those kinds of abstract notions, because she had not experienced our lives together. I could feel her small ring of muscles rapidly pulse. Her body became rock rigid, every inch squeezed. She crushed me to her chest, her knees grabbed me in an iron hold, and she threw her head back, eyes wide and staring with nothing but the whites visible. Meanwhile, I was in the course of a fantastic time. I finally got some of my senses and a little bit of my breath back. My heart rate was finally under 200 and the goosebumps were subsided. I looked down at her lovely face. She was lying limply underneath me, scarcely breathing. Small aftershocks were still rattling her. Then it hit me. Mavis had called me by my first name. She didn't know my name, only Sheriff. She was coming back to me slowly, making little yips and sighs. Finally, she opened her lovely eyes and stared at me. It was like daybreak over the Garden of Eden. Her beautifully deep and intelligent face transfixed me. There was devotion there. I couldn't even pretend to fathom the explanation for it. But this has happened before. Call it psychic, call it religious, call it deluded. Yet the first time we had been together, fate had given Mavis a glimpse of her own death. Understandably, she was in a senseless state of terror as she fled to my bed. After I had calmed her down, we made love for the first time. I answered wonderingly, "You remembered?" She replied, "I don't recall many of the facts, but I know I loved you with all my heart and that our marriage was one of joy and contentment. More important, I know that I will always adore you." She responded, her face darkening. I was making Ava a snack before I picked her up from school. Then I felt nauseated and lightheaded. I felt as though I was going to faint. I recall being overcome with remorse. Then all that was left was darkness. It brought her back. With a loud gasp, she exclaimed, "Oh my God, what will become of Ava? Will she ever be around again?" I attempted the same justification I had applied to myself. "The future is our past," I declared. "That means in 70 years. Our little girl had grown into a confident, powerful young lady by the time I left." I also mentioned that Ava had the whole community behind her, including the Jensens, the doc, and his wife. "She has a bright future whatever timeline she is in," I said as I concluded. "Perhaps we will live to see her at all. But let's simply live our lives together for the time being." I accepted the town's offer. There, I had served for years as the sheriff. However, that was 70 years away. I now had to support a wife and the unborn kid she carried inside of her. It looked like a great way to do that, to be the sheriff. I understood that, as she had been in mine, Mavis was a guest in mine. And I had to bear the terrible knowledge that Mavis had disappeared as soon as we had uncovered her dead body. She was unable to be both alive and dead at the same moment, which was a typical paradox of existence. I was therefore in the same predicament as before, and the former would prevail over the latter. It dawned on me that I would vanish 27 years from the moment of my birth. I wanted to stay with Mavis forever. She held me when I wanted to die. However, my leaving was inevitable. I couldn't be a retiree and a new mother at the same time. Thus, it was unavoidable that I would vanish. However, I had a strategy. We were watching a cute, brown-haired co-ed consume an ice cream cone on a beautiful July day. America has weathered the Vietnam War, the Flower Power Revolution, Joe McCarthy, the Korean War, and Richard Nixon. The president was a former Michigan football player, and it was the nation's bicentennial. I was hanging out at the Belleville American Music Festival with Mavis. Locals referred to it as Bam Fest. It's an annual affair with some very amazing blues music. The Madison area's college students, therefore, arrive in droves. Mavis was 56 years old and still stunning. Her bust size had grown, and that was the only positive change the three infants had made to her form. She still had that voluptuous ass and those lovely legs. Her gorgeous, wrinkle-free face, however, was still her crowning achievement. I gave a child in her early 20s a nod. He was weaving in and out of the crowd. He appeared hesitant and uneasy, as if he didn't think he belonged there. He was a handsome boy, tall and strong, clearly a farmer and not a student at a university. Mavis gave me a tender handshake. Then she headed straight for him. Caressing his arm, she asked in a provocative way, "Could you please show me where the food trucks are?" She gave the request a lot of her renowned heat. The child began to point, then gave the woman asking the question a serious look. Mavis could have been his mother. However, no parent ever looked like Mavis. The child had a better idea after that. He excitedly exclaimed, "I'll take you." How absurd. For a man, making a small extra effort was worthwhile if it meant spending time with a truly amazing woman. Mavis turned back to me and gave me a hearty wink as they left. Meanwhile, the girl went toward the parking lot after finishing her ice cream cone. Clearly, she was trying to find her companions. Thus, the child avoided bumping into the girl. The girl kept her ice cream cone intact. An apology was not given. No immediate attraction was felt. Neither dates nor marriages occurred. Moreover, I never existed. Bonus update. At the hot spot, Ava Jensen made an appearance. This was her last day in town before she embarked on a tour with the Joffrey the following week. A 21-year-old Wisconsin girl's success in the elite realm of professional dancing was unusual. However, she had put in a lot of effort to get there and had faith in her own fate. Ava was aware of her adoption. The Jensens were unable to conceive. However, they had raised and cherished Ava as if she were their own. And it was thanks to Penny Jensen's guidance and inspiration that Ava became the stunning, astute, and extraordinarily successful woman she is today. In the back booth sat Dot, the 80-year-old owner of the hot spot. There she was, with an even older woman. That woman was in her 90s, I believe. Still, her unique beauty cast a shadow, reminiscent of the crumbling remains of an especially beautiful and elegant ancient temple. The thought crossed Ava's mind, I bet my birth mother looked like her. Ava visited the Jensens at a very young age. She couldn't recall how she ended up with the Jensens or who her biological parents were. However, there were moments when she thought she had grown up in two distinct childhoods. Mavis was the older woman's name. It was one of those names fit for an old lady. Mavis had spent 70 years as the former county sheriff's wife. It was his death. For those who thought that a lifetime of passion was still possible, their marriage had been a ray of hope. Mavis was wealthy, as was her husband. The sheriff possessed a remarkable talent for making investments in obscure companies that later became household names, such as Apple, Microsoft, IBM, McDonald's, and McDonald's. He appeared to be able to glimpse into the future. Still, the sheriff and Mavis had spent their entire lives in this little, impoverished town, despite their wealth. There, they had reared their kids, and they had always regarded Ava like a member of their own family. Mavis had felt especially attached to Ava. She seemed to be acting like her great-grandchild in place of her. For this reason, when Mavis gestured for Ava to come to the table, she didn't startle her. Mavis responded, "Before you leave town, child, there's something I need to tell you." Physically, the elderly woman was delicate. Nonetheless, she retained her strong, china blue eyes, which exuded an unbreakable resolve. With trembling, Mavis got up from her seat, and her driver helped her walk to her car. Ava moved in next to her. There was silence on the way to the sheriff's vast home. Mavis appeared to be organizing her ideas. The entire bluff outside of town was occupied by the estate. The house itself was barely 30 years old, yet it was a perfect reproduction of a traditional Victorian mansion. The large grass was well manicured and had a vibrant green color. Ava heard a lawnmower somewhere in the sweltering July heat, and she could smell the freshly cut grass. A small stream meandered by the house's foundation. Over it was a complicated iron bridge. However, the elderly woman turned away from the house and ascended a perfectly trimmed cedar chip pathway. It led above the millpond to a lonely forest perched atop a small hill. Sitting beside the sheriff's grave on the marble bench were the two women. A massive willow tree, with its distinctive limbs, enveloped the entire area. There were lots of insect sounds, birdsong, and gentle summer breezes in the air. Mavis turned her head to face the imposing tombstone. A gentle, caring expression appeared on her face. Her name and the sheriff's were etched on the marker. Mavis's date of passing was the only blank that needed to be filled in. Mavis was elderly and weak, so they sat there for a moment. Ava had the vitality and sleekness of a huge cat. Mavis's life was coming to an end. Ava was just coming of age. With her blue eyes and black hair, Ava had a stunning face. Her incredible physique was refined over hours of intense dance instruction. But the two of them shared an unfathomable similarity. The elderly woman turned to face Ava and gave her a sincere, almost beseeching glance. Mavis seemed to be trying to communicate something very essential to her. With great seriousness, Mavis remarked, "I know that fate will bring the sheriff and me back together. It was fate that brought us together. Every day of my life, I pray for that." Relieved beyond measure, she sighed and murmured, "It won't be very much longer." The elderly woman hesitated then. She held both of Ava's elegantly slender hands in hers. Mavis's hands showed signs of aging. "Fate is erratic, and sometimes its turns and turns are difficult to comprehend or accept," the woman remarked. "However, you are unable to change how the cards are dealt. You must therefore play them as well as you can. That's all we asked of you now, as that's what your father and I did with you back then. We adore you and are really affluent. Thus, you will receive care for the remainder of your life. Before I departed, I just wanted you to know that." Ava let out a gasp. She had known all along. There was no justification provided. Ava, however, was aware that everything was real, and the wonder of it all overcame her. My comment: did you guys enjoy this long story and what you guys think about the ending? It wasn't something I expected, and I'm gonna take a nap real quick and prepare this week's stories to you guys. Hope you guys like the videos, and I will be back with more soon.